Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be discussing the Byzantine style, which is the first style in our series on the Middle Ages. After the fall of Rome, there was a pretty major decline in the sophistication of buildings, which we will look at today. In this lecture, we will look at the lifestyle of the Byzantine people through the lens of Byzantine art and architecture. This slide offers an overview of the styles of the Middle Ages. So we split the Middle Ages into four subgroups: Byzantine, Early Christian, Romanesque, and Gothic. These styles are each unique, but they also have a clear connection to one another. So as you'll note, the Byzantine style actually encompasses almost the entirety of the Middle Ages, with the exception of about 50 years towards the end. And none of the others technically overlap, so those are more individual, but the Byzantine style will continue on throughout the Middle Ages, and it's characterized mostly by small windows and dome-style architecture, whereas the early Christian style is going to be characterized by small windows, so it's still going to have the small windows popular in the Byzantine style, but it's going to have flat ceilings rather than domes. In the Romanesque period, the windows are going to get a little bit larger, and we're going to see the revival of that Roman arch. And finally, in the Gothic style, you're going to see those larger windows once again, but you'll see a rise in popularity of the pointed arch. So all of these are a very simplified explanation of each style, but this will give you a brief overview for what we're going to be looking at in our next 4 lectures. So on this slide, I want to go over a little bit of the background of the Byzantine Empire. So the first thing to note is Byzantium's connection to Rome. So it was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. So when the Roman Empire fell, it didn't fall in one clean swoop, similar to the way that the Greeks did. It actually just split into 2 different pieces. So you had the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. And so Byzantium became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire under the rule of Constantine, who moved that capital from Rome up to Byzantium. And this is located in modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, so very centrally located, closer to the Middle East than Rome would have been. So one of the most important aspects to consider when looking at Byzantine art and architecture is the emphasis on Christianity. So Constantine is an incredibly important figure for the Christians living in the Roman Empire, as he is widely known to be the first Christian emperor. When the Roman Empire was split, Constantine's power and commitment to his faith offered great comfort to the early Christians, who finally felt protected to practice their faith. So they basically believed that since their leader now followed the same religion that they did, they were no longer going to be persecuted for their religion, which is incredibly important to the development of Christianity as we know it today. This emphasis on Christianity also had a profound effect on the architectural style, so it shifted from these very ordered and specific temples to divine Christian churches, which were built and designed differently from these Roman temples because they were meant to have a different appeal. So while I've spent a lot of time talking about the early Christian church, which is by far the most influential piece of this puzzle, it is by no means the only world religion that is rising in this time. So we also see an increase in Islam, which was founded in about 600 CE, so about in the middle of this Byzantine time period. So when we're discussing the early church, it's also important to look at Islam through the lens of that, because they're both growing, and they're both growing quickly and competing with each other in many ways. So when we look at the early church, it's important to not group this into the idea that it is a really fragile institution. That's probably how it was in those very first decades or so CE, but towards the end of the Middle Ages and the Byzantine time period, Christianity was most was the most popular religion in the West and often played an offensive role in a series of cruel and horrible wars known as the Crusades. So they definitely grew to a point where they were strong enough to cause some serious damage. And it's important to discuss the Crusades because we know a lot about the Byzantine style from notes that the Crusaders took. So obviously these are going to be quite biased towards the Christian religion, but it is important to note that there were many competing religions going on in this time, but specifically the growth of the two Abrahamic religions in Christianity and Islam. Judaism was still going strong, so that was also part of it in Israel and the Middle East, but we definitely saw a rise in Christianity and Islam during the Byzantine period. The main thing that we're going to look at today are some examples of Byzantine architecture. So we'll look at each of these in more detail later in the lecture, but this should provide a brief overview. So first we're going to look at the very first Christian church, which is known as the Hagia Sophia, which means divine wisdom. This is located in Constantinople and, despite a pretty tumultuous history, is still standing today. We'll also look at St. Mark's in Venice, Italy, and St. Basil's in Moscow, Russia, which is the most visited Byzantine church. On this slide, you can see an image of the Hagia Sophia. So this is actually the front facade, and it has been adjusted through the years. So the Hagia Sophia is an enormous architectural marvel in Istanbul, Turkey, and was originally built as a Christian basilica nearly 1,500 years ago. Much like the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Parthenon in Athens, the Hagia Sophia is a long-enduring symbol of the cosmopolitan city. However, as notable as the structure is itself, its role in the history of Istanbul, and for that matter the world, is also significant and touches upon matters related to international politics, religion, art, and architecture. The Hagia Sophia anchors the old city of Istanbul and has served for centuries as a landmark for both Orthodox Christians and Muslims, as its significance has shifted with the dominant culture of the Turkish city. The Hagia Sophia was originally built as a basilica for the Greek Orthodox Christian Church. However, its function has changed several times in the centuries since. Byzantine Emperor Constantius commissioned the construction of the first Hagia Sophia in 360 CE. Due to fires and other disasters, the Hagia Sophia has needed to be reconstructed many times. From its opening, the third and final Hagia Sophia was indeed a remarkable structure. It combined the traditional design elements of an Orthodox basilica with a large domed roof and a semi-domed altar with two porches. The dome's supporting arches were covered with mosaics of six-winged angels. In an effort to create a grand basilica that represented all of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian decreed that all provinces under his rule send architectural pieces for use in its construction. The marble used for the floor and ceiling was produced in Anatolia and Syria, while other bricks came from as far away as northern Africa. The interior of the Hagia Sophia is lined with enormous marble slabs that were said to have been designed to imitate moving water. The Hagia Sophia's 104 columns were imported from the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, as well as from Egypt. The building measures some 269 feet in length and 240 feet in width, and at its highest point, the domed roof stretches some 180 feet into the air. When the first dome suffered a partial collapse in 557, its replacement was designed by Isidore the Younger, with structural ribs and a more pronounced arc. And this version of the structure still remains in place today. The central dome rests on a ring of windows and is supported by two semi-domes and two arched openings to create a large nave, the walls of which were originally lined with intricate Byzantine mosaics made from gold, silver, glass, terracotta, and colorful stones, and portraying well-known scenes and figures from the Christian Gospels. This image shows a different angle of the Hagia Sophia, so this is what you would see if you were standing behind the building. As I hinted at in the last slide, the Hagia Sophia has a rather tumultuous history, which is why it's an incredible feat that the building has lasted as long as it has. I'm going to go over a bit of this history now, as it does impact the design of the building and the way we see the building today. As Greek Orthodox was the official religion of the Byzantines, the Hagia Sophia was considered the central church of the faith, and thus it became the place where new emperors were crowned. The Hagia Sophia served this pivotal role in Byzantine culture and politics for much of its first 900 years in existence. However, during the Crusades, the city of Constantinople, and by extension the Hagia Sophia, was under Roman control for a brief period in the 13th century. The Hagia Sophia was severely damaged during this period, but was repaired when the Byzantines once again took control of the surrounding city. The next significant period of change for the Hagia Sophia began less than 200 years later, when the Ottomans, led by Emperor Faith Sultan Mehmed, captured Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans renamed the city Istanbul. As Islam was the central religion of the Ottomans, the Hagia Sophia was renovated into a mosque. As part of the conversion, the Ottomans covered many of the original Orthodox-themed mosaics with Islamic calligraphy designed by Kazakar Mustafa Izzat. The panels or medallions, which were hung on the columns in the nave, feature the names of Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, the first 4 caliphs, and the Prophet's 2 grandsons. The mosaic in the main dome, believed to be an image of Christ, was also covered by gold calligraphy. The mihrab or nave was installed in the wall, as is tradition in mosque, to indicate the direction toward Mecca, one of the holy cities of Islam. Ottoman Emperor Kanuni Sultan Suleiman installed 2 bronze lamps on each side of the mihrab, and Sultan Murad III added 2 marble cubes from the Turkish city of Bergama, which date back to 4 BCE. 4 minarets were also added to the original building during this period, partly for religious purposes and partly to fortify the structure following earthquakes that struck the city around this same time. The Hagia Sophia's role in politics and religion remains a contentious and important one even today, some 100 years after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. From 1935, 9 years after the Republic of Turkey was established by Ataturk, to 2020, the legendary structure was operated as a museum by the national government. Beginning in 2013, some Islamic religious leaders in the country sought to have the Hagia Sophia once again opened as a mosque. In July of 2020, the Turkish Council of State and President Erdogan reclassified it as a mosque. So now we will discuss the architectural theory involved in creating the Hagia Sophia and subsequent churches. So it has 4 pinnacles that really define the space, and it also features a main dome, which was placed on a cube thanks to a pendentive, which is just a curved triangle of vaulting formed by the intersection of the dome with supporting arches. This was quite a feat in stone carving, and as you can see here, it rivals the Pantheon in terms of the size of this dome, which was quite impressive because they didn't have access to all of the same materials that were used in the Pantheon. The dome was supported by half domes, arcades, and buttresses. A half dome is exactly what it sounds like it is. We've gone over what the arcades are, so those are just going to be those series of arches. And then it also has the buttress, which is an added support that literally butts up next to the side of a building to help prop up the wall or dome and hold up the ceiling. So the Roman dome eventually transitioned into an onion dome, which is exactly what it sounds like. So it starts off a little bit smaller at the base and then extends out to its widest point, and then ultimately comes in to form a point at the top. So we also see an evolving basilica plan. So we will go over this in much more detail in a moment, but you're essentially going to see the design of a basilica plan become far more intricate throughout this period. So you're going to have all of these main pieces that make up a basilica plan, but they're going to get more and more ornate and sophisticated as we continue. Lastly, while the Byzantine style isn't going to be as influential as some of the other styles we have studied, it did have a great impact on Russian architecture, and we can still see that quite a bit today. So on this slide, you can see a floor plan of an early basilica which utilizes half domes like the Hagia Sophia. So there are 5 major components to a basilica plan. You can kind of follow along on this left-hand image. So first you have the nave, which is a central and principal part of a Christian church extending from the entrance to the transepts. And then you have the aisle, which is a portion of a church or basilica that parallels or encircles the major sections of the structure, such as the nave, choir, or apse. The aisle is often set off by a series of columns or an arcade. So in churches, a transept is an area set crosswise to the nave in a cuneiform, so it's going to be the part that runs perpendicular to the nave. The altar is a structure upon which offerings such as sacrifices are made for religious purposes. So for our purposes, if you're looking at this image, the altar is going to be where that chancel label is. So the chancel is just the wider area around the altar, but the altar would be located in that same spot. And then you have the apse, which are the semicircular or polygonal termination to the choir chancel or aisle of a secular or ecclesiastical building. So all of these that say apsidal chapels, those are going to be the apse. So as the popularity of churches grew, the designs became far more ambitious. On this slide, you can see a later basilica plan, which featured the full onion domes. And as you can tell by this plan, this church was far more intricate than the last one we just studied, but it does still feature those 5 main elements. So you can still see the nave, the altar, the apse. It's got a very clear transept that runs across it, as well as these aisles that kind of follow alongside the nave and the transept. On this slide, you can see an image of the facade of St. Mark's in Venice, Italy. Notice the features that are similar to what we saw on the Hagia Sophia, though these are far more developed. To build St. Mark's Church, Venice brought in the spiritual and material heritage of Byzantium to the west. It features a Greek cross plan, which is more similar to an X than the traditional cross that we think of. Organization of the space is rich in evocations that are not found in other Byzantine churches. The interior has a unitary sequence subdivided into individual spatial orchestrations to which gold background mosaics ensure continuity and the church's special way of being. St. Mark's Church, begun in 1063 CE, was built on the foundation and with the walls of an earlier church also dedicated to the saint. The model for this new church, much larger than the former one, was the Basilica of the 12 Apostles in Constantinople. Beneath the presbytery and the side chapels is the crypt, housing the ancient chapel for centuries has been considered to be the repository of St. Mark's body. The architectural idea underlying St. Mark's Church is deeply rooted in the cultural context of Constantinople. The model was the Church of the 12 Apostles, built in Justinian's day and destroyed in 1462. The present-day church was built on the remains of the first and second church in the space available between the Ducal Palace and the Church of St. Theodore. Unlike Greek models, the altar, which is joined to the evangelist tomb, is not in the center of the cross but beneath the eastern presbytery cupola. The church subsequently underwent substantial modifications. The narthex was added, a Gothic rosette was opened towards the ducal palace, and the window of the horses was opened in the facade, thus altering the atmosphere of the old building. Each modification was connected with structural, political, or prestige reasons. St. Mark's Church today is considered the living heritage of Roman, Byzantine, and Venetian culture. St. Mark's was the city's chief monument, temple of civic life, as well as religious faith, bearing witness to the greatness of Venice. For about 1,000 years, it functioned as the ducal chapel, coming directly under the Doge, who nominated its primaceres with episcopal authority, and as state church under the supervision of the procurators of St. Mark. It has always been the church where the Venetian people and government have held their highest celebrations. In 1807, St. Mark's became the seat of the Patriarch of Venice and the city cathedral, thus closing its 1,000 years of ducal history. So on this slide, you can see a 3D image of St. Mark's, and as you can tell, it was highly elaborate. So this is what it would have looked like before all of those modifications that I talked about on the last slide really took place. And you can see that it features those onion domes as well as that modified basilica plan. So a Greek cross plan is still technically a basilica plan. It has all of the same elements, but the main difference is that the nave and the transept are going to be fairly equal in length. As we have seen, the architecture was almost a complete 180 turn from what we saw in Rome and Greece. So for starters, there were no orders. While buildings may have had similarities, there was nothing really dictating how each design element needed to be used. We also saw the end of the entablature, so that part that sits above the column tells you a little bit more about the building, was highly decorated. That is not there anymore. And then we also see the addition of a few new features. So we're going to see the double capital, which is just basically like a stacked capital of sorts. And then you're going to see finials on top of all of the pinnacles. And then you also get a great deal of Eastern influence, which can be seen in the lace-like patterns and the onion domes. So a lot of that is going to be thanks to trade routes, which helped the cultures interact with one another, and you can definitely see elements that were borrowed from other cultures. And this also has to do with the rise of Islam. So as Islam rose, many of you probably know, Islam does not allow for any representative pieces. So any form of decoration that they have has to be not necessarily abstract, but it can't depict people or animals or anything like that. So there's a much heavier emphasis on decoration in forms of calligraphy or just a scrolling lace-like pattern. So you're going to see a lot of that influence on either Christian churches or mosque or really any other buildings that were built in this time. You also see the addition of clerestory windows as buildings were able to become taller. These are the windows that will sit closer to the top of the building, and they just allow a really soft amount of light to wash in, as well as being good for airflow through the space. So we also saw some elements being added to the interior of buildings. So due to extra support systems, buildings were often able to be multi-storied, whether that was 2 or 3 stories tall. Those buttresses really helped hold up the wall and support the extra weight of adding stories. And then domes were also quite popular. So while we had seen them before, we had never seen them to this degree. They became far more popular than even the Romans could have imagined, and part of that is a great feat when you consider that loss of the recipe for concrete. We don't have that anymore, so they're having to do this in a way that would have required quite a bit of skill and balance. We can also see some of the elements that we have seen and discussed before, like arcades, frescoes, and mosaics. So these would all become quite popular again. So they would rise back in this time period, specifically the mosaics, which are going to reach their height during the Byzantine Empire. And then some other new elements include double capitals on columns. So like I said, those are those stacked style of capitals. And then we also see a rise in popularity of bright colors. So the Byzantine style is often associated with gold. They had access to a lot of gold leaf and similar style products. So gold was often quite popular within the empire. It was used in a lot of their mosaic works. It was used in a lot of their frescoes and their paintings. So they definitely had access to other bright colors as well, and I don't want you to think that it's just gold, but typically if you see a piece of art that is really ornate and has a lot of gold in it, Byzantine would be a good place to classify that as, just because that was one of the main features of their art. So on this slide, you can see several of those elements that we just talked about, but specifically those new double capitals. So like I said, they were kind of stacked on top of one another. And you can see that in this image here. Those lace-like patterns that came in from the east were quite popular throughout the decoration of these spaces, but was very popular on the capitals. So what you're seeing here are those lace-like capitals. You can tell that they're highly ornate and heavily carved, but they don't necessarily depict any one thing. They're just very, as mentioned in the name, lace-like. So here you're seeing an image of the interior of St. Mark's, which shows some archangels painted in these frescoes up in the pendentive. So I just want to briefly go over what a pendentive is. So it's going to be that triangular part between the two arches. So it's up in that top right-hand corner of this image here. And those were the areas that allowed for a curve so that the dome could sit on top of the cube that was below it. So it kind of helps that outer edge form towards the base of the dome. So on this slide, I want to give you just a little bit of background into that early Christian church and kind of what that religion looks for. So basically it's founded on the belief that Jesus Christ came and died to absolve the sins of the people who followed him. So a lot of the traditions that you'll see in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches were founded during this time. And there was a heavy emphasis on sainthood as well as on the archangels. So you're going to see those two things come up in their artwork quite a bit. So there were 7 archangels total, but the main 3 that were emphasized in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches were Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. So you're going to see them depicted quite a bit in all of the artwork where they allowed for representational art. And then, like I said, a lot of the traditions that are established. So the way that we take communion, as well as just some of the rites of passage, if you will, for certain people of faith, were established during this time. Moving on to ornament during this Byzantine period, ornament during the Byzantine Empire was heavily influenced by Eastern cultures. So as I mentioned before, access to trade routes gave them access to other cultures, and there was a lot of exchange of ideas between the cultures. They relied on motifs for decoration. There was no human or animal forms in the three-dimensional, and oftentimes with the rise of Islam and Islamic influence, we also lost representational art in the two-dimensional form. Though Christians still did allow for that, and it was still quite popular to depict Christ and Mary as well as other key figures within the Christian religion. The main art form was mosaic, which reached its height during this time period. And based on the notes of crusaders, we know that bright colors were often used in the spaces. Frescoes were still popular, but we also saw new methods for jewelry making and metalworking, which probably ties back to that skill in mosaics. When you're used to working with small tiles, jewelry making and metalworking are kind of a natural extension of that. And then lastly, we also see the rise of the popularity of the crescent motif due to its association with the harbor of Constantinople. The last piece of architecture that we're going to discuss is St. Basil's in Moscow. Hopefully you can already identify elements that classify this as a Byzantine church. And this is the most visited and often most recognizable piece of Byzantine architecture still standing today. So to give you a little bit more insight, I'm going to go over some information from Russian historian Carolyn McBride. So the onion domes and spires of St. Basil's Cathedral rise above Moscow's Red Square and captivate our collective imagination of Russia in a manner quite undefinable, perhaps a colorful toy resting in the palm of this cobblestone field, or a majestic icon of grandeur and power. St. Basil's, known more officially as the Cathedral of the Intercession on the Moat, is certainly a spectacle of wonder, and as such invites a vast array of symbolic interpretations rooted in equally ambiguous folkloric tales of origin. The cathedral is recognizable by its 9 multi-hued onion domes of various sizes and distances from one another, and by the gold-plated garlic dome that crowns the lofty central spire. Despite the uneven positioning of the domes from a horizontal perspective, the cathedral is actually perfectly symmetrical from above. The cathedral is also actually 9 separate chapels of different styles and names, one of which contains the tomb of Saint Vasily the Blessed, from whom the popular structure gets its name. In accordance with the strictly hierarchical nature of the time in which it was constructed, the inside spaces of the cathedral are small and could accommodate only the most elite. It is unclear where the inspiration for the odd onion domes originated, since the cathedral predates similar domes in the Mughal Empire. St. Basil's was built under the order of Tsar Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, to commemorate the capture of the Tatar stronghold Kazan in 1552. Barma and Pasnik Yakovlev may have been the architects of the cathedral, but the reality of their identities is disputed by scholars. It may have been a single architect or another individual whose name is some combination of the two. Legend holds that the architects were blinded by Ivan the Terrible after they completed the cathedral so that they could not replicate such a beautiful structure. The cultural association and connotation of St. Basil's Cathedral within Russian culture is a general concept of power, solidarity, and continuity. But to whom exactly these concepts apply, or who they include, are questions with no straightforward answers or uncomplicated interpretations. The record of the Battle of Kazan, the event which supposedly precipitated the cathedral's construction, is obscured by its folkloric quality in which Ivan the Terrible, the soldiers, and even the Tartars are dramatized and exaggerated. According to Andrei Yurganov, the seizure of Kazan came to symbolize the growing power of Moscow, the vanquishing of the infidels, and the confirmation of Ivan IV's righteousness. As indicated by the intercession in the cathedral's original title, Ivan would have sought confirmation from higher powers for legitimacy of his rule, appropriating the divine right concept of the monarchy to defend and protect his position. The cathedral appeared as a public announcement of these symbolic intentions and would have instilled national pride in Russians as a representation of victory and power. As Yurganov notes, however, the cathedral appears more in popular association to be a commemoration of the holy fool Saint Basil than the epic fairy tale-like Battle of Kazan. Saint Basil was known for many saintly predictions and acts, but was notably a respected critic of Ivan IV's cruel practices. It is possible, then, that the Russians find it more fitting to revere the cathedral as a mausoleum of a popular saintly critic than as a victory monument of a cruel monarch. Interestingly, hundreds of years after it was built, the cathedral was saved from destruction by the self-sacrifice of Baranovsky, the architect who had been ordered to prepare the cathedral for demolition, and who, according to some tales, defended the structure from Stalin by barricading himself in the church with a machine gun. Stalin was attempting to purge the Soviet Union of the remnants of imperialism. Again, the heroization of Baranovsky indicates that the cathedral is not associated with the power and continuity of the government or political system, but the determination of the Russian people to find solidarity in cultural representations that outlast such fickle and sometimes oppressive institutions. So like I said, that's going to be the very last thing that we cover today, so just note all of the areas in which you can see Byzantine influence on this building. Like I said, it's the most visited, the most recognizable, so you can definitely see a lot of the elements that we had previously discussed. So as you continue throughout this module, just make sure that you're noting the changes that are occurring within the time period, so you can see that everything became more sophisticated and more developed as we continued. So with that, I bid you adieu and have fun with the rest of your module.